Thanks for the invitation to come and address you here in Hobart. I've never been to Hobart before, never been to Australia before last Thursday, and I'm having fun so far. So, David tells me I've got 40 minutes or thereabouts to talk at you, and then I presume we can have Q&A after that. Is that right? Good. Yeah. So don't heckle until 40 minutes are over, and I've stopped. After that, you're free to heckle. So what I'm going to do is to talk mostly about my book. I didn't bring a copy, which was stupid of me. The book is called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, which came out in 2023, and then the paperback came out in March of this year. So let me start, first of all, by explaining why I wrote the book. If you were Scottish, you might detect that I'm in fact Scottish. My mother was English, my father Scottish. I was born and brought up in Scotland, but educated both in Scotland and England, and I become anglicised. So unless I'm slightly drunk or in the pulpit and say words like Jerusalem, it doesn't come out very strongly. The relevance of that is as follows. In 2014 in Scotland, there was a referendum on whether Scotland should secede from the Union, whether, in effect, the United Kingdom should disintegrate. And as an Anglo-Scot, I was viscerally, instinctively against Scottish separatism and independence. But as a Christian, attached though I might be to the UK, I had to admit that nations are not forever, nations are not divine, they come and they go. The United Kingdom did not exist until 1707. The United States almost came apart in the 1860s, and Czechoslovakia did come apart in 1993. Nations are forever. So it was possible, I thought to myself, it's possible, in spite of my visceral reaction, that the Scottish separatists are right and that the UK has come to the end of its natural life. So I decided I ought to look at some of the arguments that Scottish separatists were putting forward, and I came across this one. Britain equals empire equals evil. So Scotland must secede from the UK in order to cleanse itself of British imperial guilt and sail off into a bright new, shiny, sin-free, probably European future. Now, when I read that, I did so having off and on been reading about British imperial history for about 20 years. And when I read the equation, empire equals evil, I said to myself, you cannot say that. You cannot say that, for reasons I'll explain in due course. But it was that moment, I think, where the germ of an idea of writing a book to tell the whole truth about the British Empire came into my mind, because I'd noticed colonial history, or rather a caricature of colonial history, being used for political purposes that I regarded as destructive. But the political potency of history came to my attention in 2014. But my concern wasn't just limited to the issue of the integrity of the UK. It extended more broadly to the self-confidence of the foreign policies of Britain and other members of the Anglosphere, including Australia. In 1976, the Baghdad-born Jewish historian, Eli Kaduri, published a book called The Anglo-Arab Labyrinth. And this book was examining the question of whether the British had betrayed the Arabs in helping to establish the State of Israel, which of course is rather topical right now. They had come to be thought by the British Foreign Office, many in the British Foreign Office, that Britain had indeed betrayed the Arabs. And so in this book, Kadoorie examines that question. Did General McMahon promise Sharif Hussein that Palestine would be part of an Arab state in 1915? And Kadoorie came to the conclusion, no, the British had made no such promise. They had not betrayed the Arabs. Just to save you the trouble of reading the book, it's very dense. But I think he's persuasive. But in this book, I came across this statement. No doubt, Kadoorie wrote, no doubt, great powers do commit great crimes. But a great power is not always and necessarily in the wrong. And the canker of imaginary guilt, not even the greatest power can withstand. The canker of imaginary guilt, not even the greatest power can withstand. And it seemed to me for some years that we in Britain are again succumbing to a fresh and more general guilt about our colonial past. For us, actually, this issue is quite recent. I'm aware, having read about debates in Australia, you've been arguing about this for about 4 decades, off and on. But for us, it's quite recent. And I fear, and I've noticed, that this general guilt about our colonial past is affecting the decisions and choice and policies of our cultural institutions, our museums. It's weakening the soft international power of the Crown, and it's making us vulnerable to infinite claims of reparation for historic wrongs, not least slavery. And I suspect it has something to do with the fact the fact that our Foreign Secretary recently decided to surrender the Chagos Islands, which was a strategic catastrophe. So what I began to think needed to happen, and I began to think I might want to do this at some point, was to write a book that tells the whole truth. Yes, the bad bits, but also the good bits about Britain's imperial past. To immunize us and you and the Canadians and the New Zealanders against the canker of imaginary guilt at a time when, faced with Russian and Chinese aggression, the liberal West needs to keep all of its pillars standing. Okay, so those were the germs of the motives that were seeded 10 years ago. So in 2017, I hooked up with a very eminent historian of British and global empire in Oxford, John Darwin, and we launched a project in July 17 called Ethics and Empire. And the aim of this project was not to defend the British Empire. The aim was to look at empire from ancient China through the medieval period, European empires to the present, and to ask, in the past, how did ancient Chinese view the empires of their day? How did Muslim Arabs view Muslim empires? How did Mughals view their empire? We all know how we tend to view empire now, here. Did everyone in the past think as we did? That was the aim of the project, and it was going to run over 5 years with an annual conference. And just in case you're wondering what the answer to the question turned out to be, one of the early findings of this conference was, if you ask what ancient Chinese and medieval Arabs thought about empire, the answer is they didn't think about it at all. empire was a fact of life. And the truth is, I think probably most people in history have lived under empires. What you will find is that Arabs and Chinese would write about what makes for a virtuous or vicious emperor, but the fact of an emperor was quite unremarkable. Anyway, that was the idea of the project, launched in July 17. And then in September 17, I was in Rome attending a conference, and I'm a very irreligious conference attender. I tend to dip in and dip out. And on this occasion, I was playing truant, and I found myself a cafe and sat down and pulled out an article I'd come across by an American political scientist called Bruce Gilley, and this argument, this essay, bore the provocative title, "The Case for Colonialism." And I read this essay, and I thought to myself, this is dynamite, but he's not stupid. And in November 17, I published an article in the London Times, drawing on Gilley's article, and making what I thought was the really incontrovertible point that we British can find in our imperial past cause for both shame and pride. Both shame and pride. So that went up in the Times at the end of November 17, and then a week later I finally got round to publishing online a description of the Ethics and Empire project. So that was published on the website of my research centre. Then the following week, my wife and I were in Heathrow Airport in the fancy lounge preparing to fly to Germany to celebrate our wedding anniversary, which falls in December. The following fact I tend not to mention simply because it hands all manner of hostage to fortune, but we were in fact going to Nuremberg. Just before we started to head toward the gate, as is my obsessive wont, I needed to check my email just one last time in case there was something exciting coming my way. And in my email, my inbox, was a message from the Public Affairs Directorate of Oxford University, my university, of which I'd never heard before. And I opened it, and I was being notified that a body of students had published an online denunciation of the Ethics and Empire project, but assuring me I shouldn't worry because the university had my back. I thought no more of it until that was on a Thursday. On the Saturday, my historian collaborator John Darwin emailed me and said, "Nigel, you must make clear that the Ethics and Empire project is not about defending the British Empire." And I was puzzled because the Ethics and Empire project was not about defending the British Empire. He knew that, I knew that, the online description said that. Why do I need to make that clear, and to whom? On the Sunday, John Darwin resigned from the project. On the Tuesday, a second online denunciation was published by 58 Oxford colleagues. And on Thursday, a third online letter was published by 200 academics worldwide, addressed to my university, urging the university to withdraw its support from the project. Subsequently, by rooting around on Twitter, I discovered the origin of this campaign, which was Priyamvada Gopal, a reader in post-colonial studies at the University of Cambridge, who on the 13th of December had tweeted her political allies in Oxford, having read the online description of the Ethics and Empire project, and she tweeted, and I quote verbatim, "OMG, oh my God, this is serious shit. We need to, block capitals, shut this down." That's what started it. So this explains why yours truly is not only talking about colonialism, he's also chairman of the Free Speech Union. Because this was what alerted me to the fact we have a problem with free speech. That was all very disconcerting. I'd lost my main historian colleague. Another historian colleague withdrew from the project. So it was under threat of actually collapsing. I had old friends of mine who, seeing the controversy I was attracting because this hit the press it was in the press for about 2 weeks. I had old friends of mine who noticed I was attracting controversy and they stepped away from me because nice middle-of-the-road people don't like controversy. And I was quite unnerved. However, the good news, there were several bits of good news, but one bit of good news was that the following April, a commission editor at Bloomsbury Publishing approached me and said, you should write a book with the title, An Intelligent Person's Guide to Colonialism. And I eventually said I would do that. So that was how this book began to come about, but the road to publication was not straightforward. I was due to submit the manuscript at the end of December 2020. And I'm proud to say that on New Year's Eve 2020, at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, with a whole 9 hours to spare, I pressed the button and sent. You know the feeling, do you? I sent the manuscript off. And in January, Robin, my editor, wrote back, and he said that he was speechless with admiration for the book's rigor and comprehensiveness. He said it was one of the most important books that had come across his desk in years, and he predicted sales of up to 20,000 copies. The book then went into the copy editing process. They produced a cover. And then in March, I got an email from the top of Bloomsbury announcing that they were postponing publication indefinitely because public feeling was unfavorable. And I, being a man of a certain generation, my emotions tend to be several days behind. But my wife tells me I was devastated. I had no other publisher. And besides, I thought this issue was really important. And I thought I had some important things to say. And the thought that we in Britain had come to the stage where something that even my editor at Bloomsbury thought was important couldn't get published because public feeling is unfavorable was really depressing. And I wrote to Bloomsbury and I said, so you're you're worried about public feeling? Well, there's lots of public feeling out there. It doesn't all feel the same thing. Which bit are you worried about? And they couldn't answer me. They simply returned the contract. But the story has a happy ending. In August of 21, HarperCollins gave me a contract and published the book last year. So it all came right in the end, but not without trouble. So let me just give you a brief description of what the book is. There's a lot of history in it. The British Empire lasted roughly from 1550 to 1960, 400 years, stretched from Newfoundland to New Zealand. A lot of time, a lot of territory. And if the book does nothing else, the book is an argument, it's not just a history. If it does nothing else, I hope the reader will get the whole truth, the whole messy, complicated, lamentable, fascinating, admirable truth about the colonial past. But it's not a history book. It's not organised chronologically. I'm not an historian professionally. I'm an ethicist. So the chapters don't proceed chronologically. Every one is devoted to a particular moral question. First of all, motives. Was imperial endeavour driven mainly by a lust to dominate other peoples? Chapter 2, slavery. Should we speak of colonialism and slavery in the same breath as if they were identical? Chapter 3, racism. Was the British Empire essentially racist? And by the way, what is racism? 4, was it all about the invasion and theft of land? 5, did it perpetrate cultural genocide? 6, was it basically economic exploitative? 7, colonial government wasn't democratic. Did that make it illegitimate? And 8, should we characterize the empire as excessively violent? In case you're wondering, my answer to each of those questions is no. And in the conclusion, I attempt to make an overall moral evaluation of the British colonial past. In an epilogue, I consider the nature and motives of the current decolonisation movement. What is it they want? And then in the paperback edition, which came out this year, I added a 70-page postscript, partly to encourage people who bought the hardback to buy the paperback too, but mainly to respond to my 10 most hostile critics. So that in a nutshell is what the book is. So I'm going to do 2 more things. I will end by summarizing the argument of the book. In the book, there are 2 sections where I deal with Australia. I mean, I can't cover the whole of Australian colonial history, but there are 2 sections. The main one deals with Tasmania and the issue of genocide here, alleged genocide. And then there's a smaller section on Australia's colonial economic history. I'm not going to summarize the section on Tasmania for you here, because I want you to buy the book. What I will do is represent an address I gave in London on Monday at an annual commemorative service commemorating Admiral Arthur Phillip, who landed at Sydney Cove in 1788 in the Church of St. Mary Le Bow in the City of London. And in that address, I asked the question, did Arthur Phillip invade Aboriginal Australia? That's the question. And the first thing I do is to pull back from Australia and set that question in a global historical context. And that context is the fact that the migration of peoples and the domination and displacement of other peoples is a universal phenomenon. Maybe peoples do sometimes move and expand just because they fancy lording it over other peoples, but usually they move in search of the means of subsistence, to escape famine or poverty or persecution, or to preempt neighbors from attacking them. But peoples move throughout history, they always have. Now, in the current public controversy about colonialism, the focus lies exclusively on European migration and expansion in the late 18th and 19th centuries. But let's be clear, Europeans were late in the game, and they weren't alone. In the 1630s and 40s, the Iroquois in North America expanded northward from the southern shores of the Great Lakes, displacing the Huron, who moved westward, displacing other nations further west. While the Iroquois did incorporate female and juvenile captives. They tortured, killed, and ate male ones. A little later, in the 1700s, the Comanche, in what's the southwest of the US now, overwhelmed the Apache and established what even one sympathetic historian calls a vast slave economy. In the early 1800s, the militarized Zulu kingdom invaded westward, conducting at least one war of extermination and scattering other African peoples to 3 of the 4 winds in what is referred to as the Mfukani, the crushing. And when the Maori invaded the Chatham Islands in 1835, they killed about 10% of the Moriori and enslaved the rest. As for Aboriginal Australians, who comprise different peoples vying with one another for resources in a harsh environment, they too invaded, killed, and displaced one another. I need to confirm that. I've read that. You well know that Aboriginal peoples, it is supposed now, are deeply attached to particular parts of territory. And I'm willing to believe that. It's just that everywhere else in the world, peoples moved. And they displaced each other. And they didn't move for fun. They moved because they were trying to survive. So it would be really odd if in Australia, over the tens of thousands of years Aboriginals were here, they didn't move. And I have read somewhere that they did. For example, I guess in Central Australia, climatic changes meant that a way of life was no longer sustainable. To survive, an Aboriginal clan moved. And I assume sometimes they moved onto another clan's territory. So you have the same phenomenon here as you had in Africa and North America. But I need to confirm that. I'm hoping to have lunch with Geoffrey Blaney in Melbourne, and he may well know the answer, but I think that's right. Okay, so that's the general, as it were, global context in which to try and understand what Arthur Phillip was doing with the First Fleet in 1788. The universal phenomenon of mass migration and expansion undertaken by peoples of every skin colour, in which some overwhelmed and displaced others, often slaughtering and enslaving them. Now, Arthur Phillip himself seems to have been a remarkably admirable human being, extraordinarily humane for his time, indeed for any time. He was a convinced opponent of slavery and insisted from the beginning that slavery be banned from the colony of what became New South Wales. He was consistently careful of the welfare of those in his charge, be they seamen or convicts, and he was socially and racially egalitarian, allowing Aborigines to enter his house at will and sharing his meals with them. Now, exactly what Phillip was charged to do in Australia when he got there is a matter that historians quarrel about. Certainly establishing a penal colony under his rule and under Lachlan Macquarie's, a colony aiming at the reform and rehabilitation of convicts. Some historians, like Alan Frost, claim that the aim was also to create a strategic naval base from which to secure naval supplies of pine and flax and to extend trade. But that's disputed. I assume that like most human endeavours, the mission of the First Fleet was probably propelled by multiple motives, weighing differently with different policymakers. But the setting of a penal colony was the explicit motive. Other naval ones may have been initially tacit and conditional, but they grew louder and firmer once Britain was at war with Napoleonic France in 1802. Once he'd set foot in Sydney Cove, Arthur Phillip sought to conciliate the Aborigines he found there. He strove to avoid conflict by trying to keep white convicts, sailors and soldiers away from them, by declaring the life of a native equal to that of a white man under the law, by punishing white abusers, and by refusing to retaliate even when he himself was speared. And when the natives were struck down by life-threatening disease, he offered them medical treatment. Eventually, he did, on one occasion, authorize a limited punitive expedition in late 1790 for deterrent effect. And in that occasion, he ordered the capture or killing of 6 natives and the destruction of their weapons. By 1791, a trade in fish between newcomer and native had been established, and by the end of 1792, when Philip went back to England, relations between Britain and Aboriginal were generally friendly within the Sydney region, although tense on the frontier. David, how long a session do we have?
Another half an hour, another 20 minutes, whatever you like.
Okay, there's a fairly long section here on disease. Maybe I'll just try and summarize it. Okay, so you all know that the deadliest invasive factor possibly brought by the British was disease. The same happened in North America. Europeans went to North America. Europeans who'd been accustomed to living with domesticated animals had become immune against diseases, went to North America, moved on peoples who were not immune to those diseases, and they were devastated. In the 1700s, one historian reckons that if a North American people were subject to successive epidemics over a 50-year period, they would lose 90% of their population. So that's there and also in Australia. I'm not sure about Tasmania, but certainly Australia, the mainland, was the most devastating invasive effect. The question of what was the source of the outbreak of smallpox in Sydney Cove is unclear. I mean, the answer is unclear. There's one theory that it was introduced by Indonesian fishermen into northern Australia and then came down. No one disputes that Indonesian fishermen carry smallpox from northern Australia. It wasn't just Europeans that carried disease. The question is whether it could have got from northern Australia down to Sydney Cove. And other historians reckon it probably couldn't have done. And that makes sense to me. So did the British bring it? Yes, I mean, there was smallpox-infected matter carried by surgeons in the ships. Did that escape? We don't know. Was it brought by a French ship? We don't know. But it was the spread of smallpox amongst Aboriginal peoples that was most devastating. But although there's a conspiracy theory that some Marines conspired with the surgeon at Sydney Cove deliberately to spread smallpox. There's a Christopher Warren, I think, makes that claim. But the theory is entirely speculative. There's no positive evidence for it at all. And we know that Arthur Phillip and his senior colleagues were dismayed at the spread of disease and did everything they could to relieve it. So as far as we know, no one deliberately spread the disease. The spread was inadvertent if the British did it, and the effects were tragic, but you can't blame people for what they do inadvertently. So what happened in that case was a tragedy, not an atrocity. Put aside disease, what about land? What about the invasion of land? The establishment of a colony at Sydney did involve the occupation of territory Aboriginal Australians had been accustomed to using, and there's no evidence that I know of that Admiral Phillip sought to negotiate with them about transferring the use of their land to the settlers. And that's odd, because it was usual practice by the Imperial British in the 17th and 18th centuries to occupy land in North America and Africa with the consent of native peoples, usually by purchasing it. That's what the authorities enjoined Captain James Cook to do in Australasia in 1768. So that raises the question, why didn't Philip negotiate with the native peoples he found at Sydney Cove, especially since we know he was manifestly keen to conciliate them and showed himself extraordinarily solicitous of them? Well, I've not read the archives. There may be positive evidence of this in the archives, but it is a reasonable speculation that to him, as to all his fellow countrymen, the land they settled on around Sydney Cove had not been cultivated, had no buildings on it. It looked vacant. And I think the Aboriginals around Sydney Cove lived mainly on fish, they didn't grow stuff. So it wasn't obvious to the British settlers that they were invading land, which might be one reason why no attempt to negotiate with them was made. The other common reason given is that unlike peoples in New Zealand and North America, Australian Aborigines, their groups were very small in number, they didn't have a political hierarchy, and it wasn't clear who to negotiate with. So that may explain the lack of negotiation. All that being said, some people reckon that once the British had realised that Australia wasn't generally vacant, and that they were in fact competing with Aborigines for land as a source of food, once the British realised that, they should have stopped colonising and gone home. So why didn't they? One reason is that many Aboriginal people actually quickly accommodated themselves to the presence of the newcomers, found the settlement attractive, not least because after the first few years, the settlers provided a more secure and regular source of food. The problem with hunting-gathering is food supplies is uncertain. So in the case of those Aborigines, the presence of the settlers was not a threat, but actually quite the opposite. And therefore it wasn't resisted. And that may go some way to explaining why there was relatively little violence between settlers and Aborigines in the first 3 decades of the colony's life. But eventually, certainly by the 1820s, when more immigrants came, more settlers came, and they moved out from Sydney, it will have become clear that settlement was threatening to Aborigines, and the outbreak of more violence was a sign of that. So why didn't the British stop and reverse colonisation at that point? Well, it seems to me that by the 1820s it was too late to do. It had been attempted in North America only a few decades before with disastrous results. In 1763, at the end of the French and Indian Wars, the Imperial British had promised Native Americans that they would stop settlers invading native lands to the west of the colonies on the eastern seaboard. And to that end, the British stationed 10,000 redcoats across the Appalachian Mountains to stop settlers invading. This upset land-hungry settlers. It also upset land speculators, one of whom was George Washington. And it was this constraint on settlers' ambitions that, alongside no taxation without representation, was a main motive for the colonial rebellion. In short, the British attempt to constrain settler ambition caused the loss of the American colonies. if British authorities had thought of trying to stop further settlement in New South Wales, they would probably have had to use force and fight another war in southeastern Australia, a long, long, long way away from Britain. And given the outcome of the attempt in North America, I think British officials can be forgiven for not trying. Besides, even if the British had succeeded in vacating southeastern Australia, the vacuum would have been filled by someone else. That's a practical certainty, probably the French. If not by them, over time by the Maori or the Chinese. In 1790, the remains of Maori canoes were found on Norfolk Island, halfway between Auckland and Sydney. In 1879, evidence was found of Chinese exploration near Darwin. So sooner or later, a technologically and politically more powerful body of outsiders was going to intrude in the world of Australia's Aborigines. And given the cultural gap, the impact was going to be shocking. The only open question was the degree of brutality. Now, as far as I know, no one in London or Australia did in fact contemplate stopping or reversing colonisation. And the obvious reason why they didn't, apart from the ones I've given, was their confident belief in the possibility of human progress. The 1830s and 40s lay in the middle of what has been called the Age of Improvement. And if I was just standing outside the New South Wales Library in Sydney the other day, looking up at a statue of Richard Burke, who was a governor, and reading the plaque of all the things, all, as it were, public-spirited things this man did in terms of public hygiene and public goods. When the Victorians sought to improve things, they were very vigorous. And so at that time in the 1830s or so, medical science had invented the first vaccine against smallpox. Engineering had produced ocean-going steamships. There was a boom in the building of railways. And Christian humanitarianism had not only abolished slavery within the empire, but was engaged in securing legislation to protect the welfare of industrial workers at home. A lot of people were committed to improvement. And colonial officials in London and colonial governors in Australia genuinely believed that inducting native peoples into progressive British civilization would improve their lives. That's why annihilation and apartheid were never British imperial policy. That policy was assimilation, which assumed, I know assimilation has a bad reputation now, I think unfairly, because it assumes basic human equality. That all people, regardless of whatever level of technological and other development they stand at, all people are in principle equal in potential. And early evidence of the imperial policy of adaptive assimilation in Australia was, of course, Lachlan Macquarie's native institution at Parramatta, and then there was the granting of the vote to Aborigines in New South Wales and Victoria in the 1850s, as in Cape Colony in South Africa in 1853, to Maori males in 1867. And I'm sure I've read that Maori males were granted the vote before whites, and also to Native Americans in Eastern Canada in 1885. Unfortunately, 9 years later, the vote was taken away from Native Americans in Canada by a Liberal Premier because the natives were all voting Conservative. Now, I don't want to pretend that the road in Australia or in Canada, the road to full equality between Europeans and native peoples was a straightforward one, nor do I want to pretend that progress didn't have its downsides. Nevertheless, I do not think that any culture has a moral right to be immune from change. No culture has a moral right to be preserved in aspic. Cultural adaptation, sometimes unwelcome, sometimes welcome, is a normal part of human social life. What's more, the 19th century progressives were not all wrong. After all, today's descendants of the Aborigines of the early 19th century, even the 20% who languish in remote communities, now have the privilege of living in one of the most prosperous and liberal countries on earth. The 19th century progressives were not all wrong. So, in sum, do I think that Arthur Phillip led the invasion of Aboriginal Australia? My response is twofold. First of all, if we're going to say that, we have also to admit that his invasion was altogether more humane and liberal than that of the Iroquois, the Comanche, the Zulu, and the Maori. But second, I think we probably shouldn't talk about Arthur Phillip invading Australia because the word invasion connotes an intentional aggressiveness that was entirely lacking. It also implies the posing of an existential threat that for many Aborigines was also lacking. So I think it would be better to talk about an uninvited intrusion. But uninvited intrusion, one way or another, sooner or later, was coming to Aboriginal Australia. And Arthur Phillips was about the most fortunate the natives could have expected. Okay, so that's a kind of deep dive into a bit of Australian colonial history. That does not appear in my book. That appeared in last Monday's lecture, although part of it appeared in today's Australian newspaper. So let me complete what I have to say by explaining my overall moral evaluation of the British Empire, which you'll find in the conclusion of my book. So what I do, this comes in 6 steps. First of all, what I say is, having taken the reader through 400 years of imperial history from Newfoundland to New Zealand, you can tot up a list of bad things that the empire presided over, such as slavery, the epidemic spread of devastating disease, economic and social and cultural disruption, unjust displacement of natives by settlers, elements of racial prejudice, and needlessly wholesale cultural suppression, miscarriages of justice, unjustifiable violence, etc. So you have a list of bad things. That's on page 276, I think. Page 277, a list of good things. If the empire initially presided over the slave trade and slavery, it was among the first states in the history of the world to renounce both in the name of a Christian conviction of basic human equality in the early 1800s. And the empire then led endeavors to suppress slavery and slave trading from Brazil across Africa, India, Malaysia, New Zealand. It also colonial government moderated the disruptive impact of inevitable Western modernity upon very unmodern societies. It created regional peace by imposing an overarching imperial authority on multiple warring peoples, promoted a free market that gave native producers and entrepreneurs new economic opportunities. It provided a civil service and judiciary that was generally and extraordinarily incorrupt, developed public infrastructure, enabled foreign investment by reducing the risks of investment through establishing political stability and the rule of law, and it brought up 3 of the most prosperous and liberal states now on earth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and gave birth to another, the United States. So the first stage of my argument is to say you end up with a list of goods and evils. Can you say which, does the debit column or the credit column weigh more heavily? did the empire do more good than evil or vice versa? And my point here is, we can't possibly say. Because the goods and evils the empire caused are of such different kinds, you can't weigh them together. How much chalk is worth so much cheese? How much racial humiliation is worth so much immunization against disease? How many unjustly killed people are worth the blessings of imperial imposed peace? How much humanitarian anti-slavery would make up for the evils of slavery? I think if you ask those questions, it's clear they're absurd. You can't answer them. So if we're going to make an overall evaluation, we can't do it in that kind of cost-benefit analysis way. That's the first step in my argument. The second is this. Because the empire contained good and evil, does that mean we can't say it was essentially any one of them? Because it also contained the opposite? But if that's true, we also have to say the same of the Nazi empire. I mean, the Nazis built autobahns, and they developed the Volkswagen. I drive one, it's great. So even the Nazi regime did good things. Does that mean that we really can't make any overall judgment of good and evil about the Nazi regime? Well, no, it doesn't. What we can say is that in spite of producing some good things, there was something at the heart of the Nazi regime that was evil, massively, murderously racist, for example, or anti-Semitic. So that no matter how many Autobahns or Volkswagens the Nazis produced, they don't compensate for Auschwitz, right? And that's why you'll find that now many of the anti-colonialist critics want to assimilate the British Empire to Nazism. So the British committed genocide in Tasmania, or Churchill was just as bad as Hitler, and one black professor in Birmingham has said that. So the British really were just as bad as the Nazis. So notwithstanding how many bridges in India the British built, notwithstanding all the good stuff, it was essentially racist and evil. So I consider that argument in my book, and I dismiss all the charges. I don't think there's anything in the empire, the British Empire, equivalent to Nazism. So that's the second step in my argument. So the empire contained both good and evil. It wasn't essentially evil, centrally evil. And then you can add third, the empire underwent a moral conversion in the late 1700s, which created a persistent humanitarian impulse that began with anti-slavery, moved on to a wider concern about the impact of modernity on native peoples. In 1837, the Aborigines Protection Society was founded in London. So you have a growing, consistent humanitarian concern that shapes imperial policy. That's the third point. Fourth, the empire exported liberal institutions and traditions that often succeeded in holding colonial government to account. So in India, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, there was a free press. Colonial government until the very end was not democratic, but there was a free press, and the free press in India could be fiercely critical of colonial government. And there was also an independent judiciary, and during the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya, the judges were fiercely critical of colonial government. And I just observe that, therefore, the British Empire had liberal institutions that held government to account in a way that China and Russia and Iran do not have today. That's the fourth point. Fifth, from an early stage, the liberal political ideal of the good of self-government was alive and kicking in the empire. As early as 1820, all three Scottish governors of the East India Company ports of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta can be found to say, we British cannot possibly stay in India forever. All we can hope to do is to help create sufficiently responsible, stable government, go with grace and hopefully with goodwill Chastened by the loss of the American colonies in the 1780s, Canada, first of all, becomes the first dominion, followed by Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa in the early 1900s. And after the First World War, India was put on the same track. By 1930, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa are virtually independent states. And the ideal of the empire relaxing into a voluntary association of independent states was being articulated as early as 1917, when Jan Smuts invented the title, the British Commonwealth of Nations. That's the fifth point. And then the final point I make is this. I argue that the fruits of what the expert on the British Empire in Africa, Marjorie Perham, perceived in 1961 as an imperial, quote, progression in virtue, were on view. The fruits of this progression in virtue were on view when in 1939 the British Empire committed itself to oppose the massively murderous regime in Nazi Berlin. And between May 1940, when France fell, and June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered Hitler the only military resistance, with the exception of Greece. And I think something important is said about the mature character of the empire on the southwestern slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. If you go to Sicily and you're driving between Regalbuto and Agira, just southwest of Mount Etna, in the northeast corner of Sicily, on the left-hand side you'll come across a cemetery. As you get out of your car and walk up the gentle slopes, you'll find yourself in a Second World War cemetery, and it's full of young Canadians. And if you walk among the graves long enough, you will come across one dated the 18th of July, 1943, which belongs to a 28-year-old named H.R. Anderson. And his headstone bears the description, and I noticed this because I've not seen it before, anti-fascist fighter. Anderson was a volunteer, willingly answering the call. And that will have been true to many of the young Australian conscripts who now lie buried in the desert near El Alamein. The Canadians were not conscripts, the Australians were, but I'm sure many of the Australian conscripts were also anti-fascist fighters. They answered the call to fight fascism. And who called them? The Empire. And I think that says something important about what the Empire had become. I'm not claiming the Empire at the end of its life was sin-free. It certainly wasn't. I'm a Christian. I don't really expect anything human to be sin-free. But the Empire had become, in important ways, humane and liberal. And that's the conclusion of my argument. I've gone longer than I planned. Thanks for your patience. Yeah.